So, in the last video, I mentioned different translations and explained a little bit why we were going to use the New Living for the Esther series. And I know that's been a question with some of my students in particular. We've talked a little bit about translations, and there's so many translations that it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I mentioned you need to know a little bit about translations to be careful and use them right. So I wanted to give you just a brief overview of Bible translations. I'm not a super expert, but I know enough a little bit to at least get you going. So, first thing we have to ask is, what is a translation for? Well, the Bible is written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And at that, with Greek, for instance, it's not the same Greek that is spoken in Greece today. It's a certain kind of Greek. I'm not going to get too deep into the details of that, but it's an old Greek, and it's a fisherman's Greek, common everyday man language for that time that it was written in. It wasn't the language of the nobles, it was the language of the common people. So, what we have a translation for is to accomplish the same purpose of why the New Testament was written in Greek in the first place, so that the everyday common person can access it and understand it. And in the English language, most of us don't speak Greek, we don't speak Hebrew, we don't know how to read those languages. It takes years of study to be able to interpret them, so translations were developed so that we all can have access to the Bible. So, here's the inherent problem with translations. And one of the things I said in the Esther video was, even the best translations are translations. So what did I mean by that? Well, the inherent problem with all translations, no matter which one you use, is that it's a translation, which means interpretation was involved at some level. Now, I'll just use a common thing. We have one word for love. There are several in Greek. And so we have to translate in some way. We have to interpret what is meant for the English audience, because if we just say love and leave it at that, then we're not getting the full meaning that was intended in the Greek. And there's other instances, there's Greek words in the Bible that we didn't have a word for in the English language, so we had to interpret it so that we could find the best way to put it into our language so that people could understand it. You can't just translate word for word and get anything that makes any sense whatsoever. To put it in an example that more people will understand here in America and in Texas especially, most of us in high school have to take Spanish. Now, when you take Spanish, you have to interpret the meaning for English to make sense. Now, if you just took an English sentence and just word for word changed that word to the Spanish equivalent, you're going to run into a variety of problems. It's not going to make any sense because it's not in the same order that the Spanish language would speak, so it won't make any sense if you just go word for word across the sentence. The other problem is, which word do I use? To get a word that means a particular thing, there could be several ones. To use the Spanish example again, just because I'm slightly familiar with it, and most of you will be too, there's two words for to know. So if you're saying I know somebody, you would use a different I know than if you know what Bible translations are. So if you have knowledge about something, that's different from saying you know somebody. So you have to determine which one do I use, and it gets a lot more complicated with that, especially when you're translating Hebrew and Greek into English. You have to determine, okay, which word that means what they're trying to say is the best word in English to convey the meaning that it was originally intended. And it's a very complicated process. And good translations use a whole lot of interpreters, and they all get together to determine that. Now, it gets really complicated when you get into the Hebrew language and you're trying to translate the Old Testament, because ancient Hebrew has no vowels. It's all consonants. And so different sets of consonants can come together, and they actually have to interpret which word it is at all. And they have to use context clues to determine, okay, are you saying this word or are you saying this word? Because think about it, if you took the English language and you got rid of all the vowels, and so all the words were just the consonants, and so there's no A, E, I, O, or U. You take all those letters out, and that's what the ancient Hebrew is. Now later they developed a system that would tell you which vowel sounds you're supposed to be using, but the ancient Hebrew didn't even have that. So people would have to use the context of what was being said to interpret what word was even being used, and then they would have to interpret which word best reflected that word into English. So it's a very complicated process. There's a whole lot to it, and to some degree, there's human opinion involved. Now, Orthodox Christianity believes that the Word of God is perfect and infallible because it's given by God. It's given by the Holy Spirit. There's human authors, but they were inspired from the Holy Spirit. So everything that should be there is there. And that's true in the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. But once you start adding a human element to the spiritual element, then you have something that is inherently imperfect. So all translations are inherently imperfect because they involve human interpretation. And you can see that in different Bible studies. You can listen to different preachers or read different commentaries, and they will have a different opinion of what a text means. That's in English. That whole translation, that whole interpretation, that whole opinion goes back to the original changing of the words to the modern language. So you have something inherently imperfect because humans have gotten involved in it. So the Bible is perfect in the original language, but all translations are inherently imperfect due to interpretation, which is why pastors will still use the original languages. They'll still use multiple translations to try to get to the core of the original meaning. Now, for the controversial part, there are groups of people that believe that the King James Version is the only acceptable translation for the English language. Now, I used to be one of those people. I firmly believed that. I was almost militant in my belief that the King James Version was the only acceptable one, and there are churches that in their essential doctrine teach that it is God's translation for the English language. I said I used to be one of those. I am not one of those any longer, and I will explain why. But a lot of it comes from good intentions. It's not that they're evil, that it's good intentions. And one of the main things that they're worried about is that people are taking stuff out of the Bible. And if you just compare the translations directly, like if you look at ESV and you look at King James, you're like, ESV took stuff out of the Bible. They're messing with the Bible. That's not actually what's happening. Now, it's a legitimate concern because there are groups of people that will take out things from the Bible and establish wrong teaching. The biggest example of that is the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have their own translation called the New World Translation. That translation is trash. It was changed specifically for wrong teaching. So the concern that people are using these different translations to teach false doctrine is a legitimate concern because it is happening. However, the Mormon Church uses the King James Version of the Bible, and obviously they are teaching false doctrines as well. And most of the people arguing for King James only would agree that the Mormons are teaching a false doctrine, but they're using the same version. So it's not always the translation that's going to lead to wrong teaching. It's wrong teaching, and then they'll find a way to twist whatever they have access to. But it is a legitimate concern. So why does the ESV, for instance, not have things that are in the King James Version? Okay, so what's happening is it's a difference of the manuscripts that are being translated. So we don't have the very first manuscript of what was written in the original New Testament, for instance. What we have are copies of copies. So we compare all of the copies to get to the original. And now, in modern translations, we have access to a lot more copies of the manuscripts than they did have whenever they translated the King James Version. We just have access to more. The King James Version was translated by Anglican priests who did the best they had with what they had, and they came up with the King James Version. Now we have a whole lot more manuscripts to compare against each other. So what they've basically determined that happened is these manuscripts that were used to translate into the King James Version, I'm going to really dumb this down, but basically they contained a lot of notes. So what basically happens, look at like a pastor's Bible or my wife's Bible, there's a ton of writing in it. And writing in the margins, underlining, highlighting things, writing stuff in. That's basically what happened, is they got a hold of manuscripts that had extra stuff written in, but it's basically they copied somebody's notes and put it into the translation of the Bible by mistake. So it's not that the ESV is taking stuff out of the Bible, it's actually the opposite. The King James Version added stuff in. Now for an example of that, you can look at the book of Mark and in chapter 16. Now it ends in verse 8. If you look at the King James Version, there's a whole lot more after verse 8. This is notes added in, and I'm just going to look at it. So after Mark 16 verse 9, now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, and they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country, and they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will be by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover. So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. Amen. Now, most of that, there's nothing wrong with it. It's what happened. It's basically a comparison of, well, Mark was the first gospel written, and it ends in verse 8 And so it ends like this. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Well, obviously it can't end there. Something had to happen because Christianity obviously grew and they didn't keep it to themselves. So in the notes that were added basically just includes, well, this is what happened in Matthew, a later gospel that was written, and Luke and John, and it basically compares and adds in the notes of what happened. If you look at now this is actually a part where false doctrines get taught. In this section that's in King James but not newer translations, the snake handling stuff. It says that they'll be bit by snakes and not harmed, and drink poison and not be harmed. There's false churches that teach this kind of thing and try to show that they're the legitimate ones because they can handle snakes and get bit and not be hurt, and that's the sign that they're whatever. That's obviously, well, it's not actually there in the Bible for one thing, it's a note, but look at what he's talking about. He's talking about Paul. Paul was bit by a snake and not harmed. These different things. It's talking about things that happened, so it's good notes, but it's not part of the Bible, and people will base their entire church around those parts that aren't actually there to form false teachings. So the worry that, oh, you've taken stuff out of the Bible, that's going to lead to false doctrines and false teachings, it's actually working more in the reverse, where this addition to the Bible that was notes from scribes is leading to false teachings. And so I don't want to bash the King James Version too much, but it definitely is not the infallible translation that some people try to make it out to be because of those things. Now, the King James Version is a good translation, especially if you're an 18th century British citizen. So it's in a language that is no longer used by the common people. You actually have to use a dictionary from the 18th century, and you have to interpret the King James Version all over again a lot of the time for the modern English speaker. So that gets into the third problem of the King James Version, in that it's not fulfilling the role of a translation. Now, we talked about that at the very beginning. What's the purpose of a translation? It's so that it's accessible to the every average ordinary speaker. And so the King James Version no longer fulfills that role in our time. However, it should not be thrown out and completely just ganged up on and said it's bad. It is a good translation. It has its problems, but it is a good translation, but it is a translation. However, the King James Version is historically and linguistically significant. So it was a big deal for a long time. It was the English translation. It was called the Authorized Translation for a reason. It was the authorized by the Anglican Church. So if you are still a King James Version only and you say, no, the people that translated it were infallible and inspired by God, well, you're relying on Anglican priests. So you're relying basically on the clergy of a church that was founded so that the King of England could divorce his wives. Good translation, but obviously it has its problems. However, it is historically significant. And also, it really affected the English language. A lot of the sayings that we have in the English language, or the idioms, are from the King James Bible. So it helped shape the English language as we know it. And also, it's a personally significant work. I learned how to be saved from the King James Bible. So it can have value, it can still be used, and some people are going to hold to it because that was the Bible they grew up with, that was what they know, that's what they memorized, that is what they're comfortable with. And so if you want to use the King James Version, by all means use it. Just be aware that it is a translation. Just be aware of its problems. Just be aware that sometimes you're going to have to look up words because they don't mean the same thing that they mean today. Good translation, not an infallible translation, and nothing that can be dogmatically stated that if you use anything other than the King James Version, then you're a bad Christian. As I would used to say, I'd basically tell you that you're a cult if you didn't use the King James Version. That's not true. And other translations aren't actually doing the things that King James only people say that they're doing. So, what do we use and when? And this part is completely opinion based. So, if I want to focus on the story, if I just want to read morning devotions, then I'm just reading through the Bible, or if I want to read the Bible to children, probably the best translation, in my opinion, is the New Living Translation. It's a very good one for those purposes. However, if I want to be text-focused, I want to compare, I want to do word studies, I want to really dig into the language, I want to get the most meaning, I want something that's very literal and as close to the original text as possible. Well, the king of close to the original text as possible is New American Standard. That's the most literal translation there is. However, sometimes the New American Standard, because it is so literal and close to the original text, it can read wonky. It can be difficult to read. So there's also ESV is a good one, New King James Version. If I were to be leading a church and I was going to say, okay, here's the main one we're going to use for our services, I would choose one of those three: New American Standard, ESV, New King James Version. New King, they have their pros and cons. New King James Version is probably the most accessible out of all the translations. New American Standard is probably the most literal and accurate to the original text. In our youth group, you may notice we use ESV. Our main services uses New King James Version, and our youth service uses the ESV. The reason that the ESV was chosen is because another thing that you have to consider when you're choosing a Bible to use is reading level. So they all have reading levels based on grade, and guess what? For youth, the target reading level, that's the ESV. So you have a very literal translation that's very close to the same. It's a formal translation rather than a dynamic translation. New Living Translation is dynamic, which means it is just trying to get to the point. And formal is it is trying to keep intact as much as possible the original way things were written, the original grammar, structure, and all of that. So ESV is a good formal translation for youth because it is written at the target reading level of youth students. And in the main service, we use New King James Version. And the reason we use New King James Version is because it's a formal translation. It bridges the gap somewhat with the King James and the modern language speaker. And it's an extremely accessible translation. It's very easy to get a New King James Bible almost anywhere at any bookstore or a Christian bookstore or anything like that. So if you are doing a main service, I'd use one of those three. There are others, but I would use one of those three personally. Now, if I'm doing a deep personal Bible study for myself where I really want to dig into something, say I really want to read the book of Philippians for myself, and I want to dig deep, and I want to get into the grammar, and I want to know everything that I can know about it, well, then I'm going to use multiple of those. Probably all four of those. Read it in the New Living, read it in the New American Standard, read it in the ESV, read it in the New King James Version, and you're going to notice differences, different words that were chosen. That's the interpretation. So you're going to get multiple interpretations of what the text is saying if you will do that, and that will get you closer. It's almost like reading several commentaries. Read several versions, and you're going to get closer. If I'm getting ready to do a lesson, I read the text in multiple translations. Usually I'll read it in the New King James, in the ESV, in the New American Standard, in in the New Living Translation. Maybe I'll add some others. Some other ones that are pretty good are the HCSB. There's some other ones. I'm personally not a fan of the NIV, but a lot of people have used it. It's an accessible translation. It's a dynamic, not a formal, so I wouldn't want to use it in a main service, but it does have its uses. And as far as what it would be used for in reading devotions and just getting the story and stuff, I think the New Living is better than the NIV, in my personal opinion. But if you want to do deep Bible study, use multiple translations. If you don't speak Greek or Hebrew, you need to read multiple translations so that you can get to the gist of the text, because you're going to get the multiple translations and you're going to be able to get a better understanding of what the words used actually are. So I hope that video was helpful to you. Share it with your friends. If you have any more questions, you can contact me, and I hope that this virus stuff ends and we can meet together soon. But I'm going to probably continue these series. We'll be getting into the Esther series. I'll make another video for that soon. And in the meantime, I hope that we can all keep growing together. Thank you.